Is that mic working okay? You hear all right? Yeah. Okay. So our class here at the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery is part of the extension program of Dharma Buddhist University. There's a number of classes. You can go online and see what they are. It's also a continuation of the format we're doing. It's a continuation of the format that I grew up with in the monastery under my teachers, but particularly Master Hua, where you had the daily monastic routine, getting up early, doing the morning chanting ceremonies and mantras and bowing, sitting meditation, quiet study, and now we've added some Tai Chi exercises to help fortify the body and the mind. And then usually a meal at midday for older people or older cultivators here. Sometimes there's a breakfast. And then afternoon activities, again, quiet, sometimes bowing, repentance, sometimes translation work, sometimes just physical work, depending on where we are. We're in the city here, so it's not like taking care of the gardens or fields, but there's still a lot to maintain. In the Redwood Vihara, there's an incredible amount of physical work that could and should be done. Clearing the downed trees, clearing away the debris from the fires, cutting some new trails in the property. We've got a couple hundred acres there, ideal for walking meditation through the deep redwood forest with little places one can sit and contemplate. But all that has to be done by hand. So it's ideal. In the past, this was sort of the routine. In the Trappist tradition, which I'm somewhat familiar with, it was orare et labore, to pray and to work was the daily practice. At Shuyin's monastery, they would work the hillside and the fields quite rigorously for most of the day, but then just do long periods of sitting with profound silence in between. This hasn't changed much, but in our tradition also, there's another element that my teacher really emphasized, which was the combination of study with practice. That the practicing of the meditation, even the bowing, the chanting, the rituals, all of them required a deep grounding and guidance by the theory that you find in the text, by the principles, the underlying principles that tie this all together, because the actions by themselves, however well intentioned, without mind ground cultivation going along with it, can easily end up as just routinized behavior. But add the element of understanding of insight that the text and the sutras provide, suddenly the practice have guidance, they have direction, they have compass. And correspondingly, if you just have the study and memorization and intellectual approach without the practice, it doesn't bear any fruit. It's just sterile. So when my teacher was around, we would have at least 2 and sometimes 3 and sometimes more Dharma classes during the day where we looked into the text, primarily in this tradition out of the Chinese text, but to some degree also the Sanskrit and Pali. Tried to translate that as we went along, and then tried to have discussion and investigation of it either through lectures or some combinations of lecture and a shared inquiry interpretation. And that was really the food. I mean, the food is very simple at the monastery. It's a simple vegetarian fare. But the deeper food that was nourishing the mind was this material. And so we continue that tradition here with our classes. We call it Dharma Realm Buddhist University, but actually it's a continuing tradition that goes back to the best, and I would say the brightest traditions of the Dharma as it came out of Asia into the West now, and maintaining that close, thoughtful study, which requires learning as a prerequisite for entering the text, and the kind of learning that has to do with the study of language, the study of philosophy, and the study of, maybe if you want to use this word, the key reference text where all these terms are brought together and discussed. So this is really scholarly and also very existential type of work. Anyhow, what we're doing here tonight is in a microcosm, a repetition of that. In other words, these evening lectures have been going on for decades under my teacher, and prior to him, his teachers, and so forth. This is done primarily in English. Originally, when I was here, it was done in Chinese, and then we would pause, and somebody would translate, for 5 minutes, then the master would speak for 5 minutes and translate for 5 minutes. Later, we would transcribe those talks into commentary to the sutra that was being lectured on and so forth. Here, we're doing mostly just English in the evenings to a largely English-speaking audience. And I feel badly that I can't really be bilingual. And this is my laziness over the years of not really getting aplomb with Chinese. But I think now a little bit of the Chinese is being translated tonight, perhaps. Is it still the case, Locke? Or no? Yes. Yeah. So at least somebody else is doing the hard work of translating this into Chinese. And I think Dharma Master Sure's Saturday night class is bilingual or no? Yeah. So we're trying to keep up the tradition. Sometimes in the past we had 5 different languages. We have Mandarin, Goyu, Guangdonghua, Cantonese, and then we might have Vietnamese, and then 2 other dialects of Chinese. So there could be 5 translations. So the master's lecture could be, an hour lecture could turn out to be maybe 12 minutes with all the different translations. But I feel most at home when we're repeating this form. Now I should say the class to some people starts at 8:15. That's when they tune in. But actually the class starts at 7:30. Because 7:30 to 8:15 we do quiet sitting meditation. And this is not sort of a parallel thing or even necessarily an additional element. It's actually, as we were trained, integral to what we're doing for these 45 minutes. So the 45 minutes of investigating the text is grounded on 45 minutes of stilling the mind prior to investigating the text, because these texts were spoken out of a samadhi, out of a deep concentrated state of mind, and the only way you can really get close to their meaning, get close to the vibe and the spirit of that, is to try as close as you can to come to that state of samadhi prior to the listening. So the actual listening and the preparation for listening is being done in those 45 minutes prior to this. So I'm saying this not for everybody that's here, because everybody that's here tonight sat for 45 minutes prior. I'm just saying this to people online. You will get more out of the text and the wrestling with the meaning of the text if you do those 45 minutes prior to actually just listening. This is easy to neglect, but it's especially it's neglected in, I'll say this, generally the academic study of Buddhism pays less and less attention to this key element, this key hermeneutical element for regaining meaning, which is the contemplative dimension prior to and alongside with, integral to the study. So that's something we hope not to lose. In any event, so tonight we're going to go back after halfway through the class. We're going to continue the class now, not just start it, excuse me. It's getting colder here. And we're in California, so anybody who's not in California and listening to this, who's not in the southern hemisphere, is probably a lot colder than here in California. So that being said too, as the weather changes, to maintain balance, it's quite important to make sure that the amount of clothes you have is adequate, not too much and not too little. We have blankets here, even though we're inside. I don't feel any heat on in here tonight, so the blankets covering the legs is just a good thing to do when you're doing sitting meditation, because sitting on cold concrete or stone or something like this over time will really hurt the body in meditation, so it's important to keep a middle way with regards to that. So tonight we'll pick up again on chapter 9. And I'm going to do something, maybe a little bit of a departure in my approach. I'm going to look at these verses and just read them through to the end. Maybe we have 5 verses or 6, I'm not sure how many are left. That will give the impression that we're moving right along. And then I will come back and I'm going to choose basically one concept from these verses that seems to be recurring throughout, a very key concept. That deserves some attention. Rather than trying to analyze every sentence, I'm just going to look at this point at that concept. The next verses may have another. So I'm going to change the method a little, but if we go back to the text, I'm looking at where this first appears. Okay, right after the verse of unmoving, he leaves the two extremes. And maybe we'll together maybe, have we done this in Chinese, these verses here last week? The Rao You Jian Ru Lai, I think we have, right? We read through that. Shen Shen Li Fan Bie, Zi Yu Yi Che Fa, right? Didn't we do that in Chinese? Anybody remember? And then didn't we do the next one? Yi Che Shi Jian Zhong Chu Chu Zhuan Fa Lun. Maybe not, huh? Right, because you gave a talk on that. So let's go down and just read the next 2 verses, and then we'll read them to the end in English. So we're not doing everything together. So we're looking at Yu Fa, right? Yu Fa Wu Yi Huo Yong Jue Zhu Xin Lun Xi Lun Bu Sheng 分别心十年佛菩提了知四别法不着有言说无有一切多使命随佛教. Okay, and then the English, if we go back, because I want to catch this first word where it appears, if one sees it thus come with body and mind apart from discriminations, that line that we looked at before. So this is what I'm going to concentrate on, the discriminations. That's English. In the Chinese, if you look over, it's fan bie. I believe it's, fan bie. A compound, which this BTTS group translates as discriminations. If you go down and continue reading, you have the turning of the Dharma we talked about. And then again, on this verse, to be without doubt or delusion with regard to dharmas, to eternally sever all irrelevant discussion, and not give rise to or generate discriminating thoughts is called being mindful of the Buddha's Bodhi. Okay, so here we have discriminating again. If you look at it in the Chinese on the 3rd line, you'll see it's all fan bie xin. So basically, It's translated as discriminating thoughts or discriminating mind, but discrimination being an exercise of the mind, you don't necessarily have to literally translate the shin there because it's implied. Funbie is a mental activity. But sometimes in the Chinese, the shin is put there to accent that. But in English, if you say, a thought of the mind is redundant, right? You don't have to say a thought of the mind, even though it might read like that in Chinese. But there you have not giving rise to, not using discrimination. The next one spins off of discrimination, and it's very interesting that conjoined with this idea of what discrimination means, and I'm going to go into that in some detail, comes one of the manifestations when the mind gets caught up in that splitting off and the dicing and discursive thinking. It's all related to this idea of funbie. Then it easily turns into debate and argumentation. So this line, to understand, and you go down, to know differentiating dharmas, the different kinds of dharmas, or to differentiate, but not to attach to words and speech, is the exhortation there. And then it says, and to be without one or many is called according to the Buddha's teaching, or with the teaching. And then again you have the next verse, the many does not have the nature of the one is also without the many. To cast both completely aside is to universally enter the Buddha's merit and virtue. This passage here is saying something about the funbie turns into this thing between the one and many, splitting them off, the one and the many and whatnot, and having a mind like that. So the funbie is to say, to stop that kind of discursive discrimination, you cast this aside. And then it goes on, when living beings and lands are entirely still and quiescent, living beings and lands are another funbie, another discriminated way of splitting off a sort of the unified nature of reality. When you see them as still and quiet, as not having a self-nature of their own and so forth, then it says, and without reliance or discrimination. So now you see discrimination again turning up, again in the third line, wu funbie, without, free of discrimination. Then they're able to enter the Buddha's Bodhi. And finally, the last verse, of living beings and lands, neither one nor many can be obtained. To well contemplate and observe in this way is knowing the meaning of the Buddha Dharma. Whoa, this is really, the meaning of the teachings of the enlightened being, of the Buddha Dharma, is to understand that there's not one thing that can be obtained. This is the fundamental teaching of non-attachment, in the sense that not trying to obtain what cannot be obtained is the attempt to attach and grasp, but it's going to be frustrated because there is not fundamentally one thing self-existing that can be got or obtained. So that's a little run on the verses, but now I'd like to spend at least the rest of this time, and perhaps even go into this more next week, because it's so key not only to understand these teachings, but to actually be able to use these teachings in a applied, efficacious way, is to understand this notion of funbie in Chinese. Basically, this last line that says, knowing the meaning of the Buddha Dharma, knowing the meaning of the Buddha Dharma, the Avatamsaka is really the teaching and the understanding and unbinding and expanding of the mind in all its states. The Buddha Dharma is about the teaching of the mind. And you could say it's this mind, our mind, the human mind. And it's not only the teaching about it, but it's the understanding of it. It's the unbinding of its capacity and expanding it past its narrow purchase, where it kind of collapses into a funbie consciousness, a limited discursive consciousness. That's why sometimes the Avatamsaka is called the king of kings of sutras, because it goes to the most fundamental, powerful mechanism or place of agency in our lives, which is the mind and its states. And so to go into this text well It means we have to tease out as best we can the actual applicable pragmatic mechanisms that are presented to us here of how we use, understand, expand, and liberate the mind. This is what it's about. It's the deepest human psychology that I think is available. It's very profound, very rich. And so part of what we have to do here is first get less the language of Tathagata, Bodhisattva, Buddha as some exterior entities out there in the stratosphere who are in some heavens looking down in that vision we have, but rather see them as these are expressions or adjectives to describe a capacity of the human mind and the capacity of a human being. So sages, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Tathagatas are nothing more than extensions or perfections or refinement of us as we exist. So these are not description of other, but rather descriptions of self, in not the narrow sense of self, but of self-nature, of our true potential. Then we can get away from this as this is describing them, but rather describing a potential or capacity that we have. So in that is not only describing what we might become in this mind of liberated, free from discrimination and so forth, really understanding, but how to do that as well. So this is really, really important in reading the Avatamsaka. Otherwise, people can read and end up reading the Avatamsaka as some esoteric, far out, metaphysical, magical, not connected with the ordinary and the human. This is not how I was taught to study it, and it was not how it was taught to me. But it takes a little bit of deconstructing the gap, the barrier between the ordinary and the extraordinary, or the living being and the Buddha, to be able to make that. And so the interpretation mechanism that we use is to see this as different ways of describing the human, not different ways of describing the supranatural, but rather different ways of describing the human, if that makes sense. So then Bodhisattva, Buddha, Tathagata are just adjectives that apply to states of mind and body that we can achieve, we can realize, we can bring to fruition. So if that's the case, then the text, then you use it more as a mirror and as a magnifying glass. And I would say also as a compass. I'm using pragmatic terms. So as a mirror is something that reflects, you look into, and it can reflect your mind, your consciousness. It can shed light on the deepest workings and the layers of your mind and consciousness. But it also is a magnifying glass in that it can really highlight and accentuate and enlarge the most important things about the mind and its states. And correspondingly, the things that stand in the way, the obstructions to that. But it's also a compass in that it helps orient, navigate. And then finally, I would say, for me, it's a tuning fork. It's something I can hit. You know, every Friday night I can hit this, or in preparation for this, I hit this tuning fork, and I see how much that aligns with my own sounds, with my own alignments. And so as you tune a guitar or an instrument or piano by hitting the tuning fork first and then adjusting those strings, you can use this sutra as hitting a sound, and then you correspondingly start to adjust, by metaphor, your own strings. So the Avatamsaka preface then, which is a great poem extolling and describing the merits and the depth of the Avatamsaka itself. This is written by Chen Guang, or Qingliang Guoshi, the great master Qingliang. But in the early part of that verse, he says, what is this text? What is it about? It opens and discloses. It opens and discloses the mysterious and the subtle within us. It understands and expands the mind and all its states. That's the second line. And this is really rich. It exhausts principle or truth and fathoms the nature. Deep and wide and interfused, vast and great and totally complete. Surely this must be the great means, expansive, flower dormant sutra. I'll give a pause there. It seems like we have visitors. I guess I'll go on. Once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of lore, and suddenly there came a tapping as if something gently rapping gently on my front door. "'Tis nothing but the wind," I muttered, "the wind and nothing more." Thank you, Alex. Alex comes in and goes, "I don't know. We heard a rapping and it wasn't anybody." I was just quoting Edgar Allan Poe, sorry. So, that being the case for the Avatamsaka and what it can deliver, and it says in that preface, it's about the mind, understanding the mind and its states, and then goes on. So in these lines, we have with mind and body apart from discriminations, and then we have not give rise to discrimination thoughts, and then it says without reliance or discriminations. So this is what I'm going to focus on basically tonight, that you could see this whole section of verse having many different themes, but this one theme of discrimination and discernment. And this is where the balance lies, because this very mind that falsely discriminates and distorts is the very same mind that penetrates and discerns. So this is very interesting. Go a little bit into the Sanskrit as I understand it, and this is not my area of expertise at all, but I use the Sanskrit to some extent to help me get at the Chinese, because the funbie in Chinese is coming from a Sanskrit term and was rendered as funbie. We translated as discrimination, and I just have to say outright, whenever I try this on an English-speaking audience, none of the depth of this comes through with that word discrimination. I mean, if I ask you what discrimination means, just the group here, what does it mean to you when you hear it in English? Discrimination, non-discrimination, go ahead. How's that?
Like make distinctions between things?
Make distinction between things. It also has a connotation of bias and prejudice, right? So we don't discriminate on the basis of race, creed, and so on and so forth. It's a disclaimer of a kind of false bias or prejudice to separate one thing from the other. But we also use it as discriminating taste. And there we use it more in a positive sense. So someone who has discriminating taste is someone with an attuned discernment. But in this sense, it goes so deeply into Buddhist psychology that we have to go further past the conventional understanding. Whether we ever come up with an adequate English equivalent, I don't know. But in this case, I think we just look at what's here and try to figure out and then see if there's another equivalent we come up with. Usually this leads to footnotes, though. So funbie carries two connotations, one positive, one negative. The negative is basically a taint or beclouding of the mind produced by a moving of the mind off center. This is what Huineng calls in the place of turning. And what he means by the place of turning is in the field of consciousness, which is at the core of our being. If consciousness attaches and gets moved into emotional attachment, it becomes ordinary, and the various consciousnesses and discrimination then arise between subject and so forth. If consciousness does not attach and linger on emotions and greed and anger, it turns into wisdom. So this verse, the sixth patriarch says, if in the place of turning you don't linger attached to these emotional things, these emotional states of mind, consciousness becomes penetrating wisdom, mirror bright wisdom. If on the other hand, you do get turned or moved, funbie, then wisdom turns into ordinary consciousness. So the place of turning is what he's talking about. For people who are cultivating when you're meditating, it's right at this place where you observe the rise and fall. But if you don't just calmly observe the rise and fall and you reject, push away, or attach, the place of turning, then wisdom turns into consciousness, and then consciousness turns into afflictions. I don't know if you're, but this goes back to Huineng's text. So consciousness and wisdom shift and turn in this place of turning. which then manifest as an artificial dividing discrimination and consequent failure to see the fundamental identity of all things. And it's no longer Sure. It's split up. The fundamental identity of all things, by the way, is called a state of samadhi in the Avatamsaka, and it's called the level equality of all dharmas. You enter into an equanimity wherein which you see the level equality, the sameness of all conditioned things. This is actually considered a state of absorption, if you will, but it's not so much absorption of loss of awareness and pulling back, but it's an actual perspicacity, it's an actual seeing of things as they really are. And as they really are, like dreams, illusions, bubbles, shadows, as conditioned things that can't be obtained and got at, then you can relax at that place of turning and not be moved. And if you are not moved, you then see things truly as they are. This is what the text is meaning. You understand the Buddha Dharma, you understand the Buddha's Bodhi. If, however, in that place, the funbi arises, then the level equality of dharmas is gone, and they become the 10,000 things, very different, having identities and things of their own. So the positive side of this is that it means a clear discernment, a good reasoning. This can be used in a positive sense. As in, say, like Abhidharma. Abhidharma is a method or study, and it's a method of study and practice that analyzes conscious experience. And in this sense, it means it analyzes one's world. The world that we have generated through the divided consciousness is then looked at through Abhidharma and analyzed bit by bit by bit by bit. And it's analyzed into its constituent mental and physical events. So this is really critical. What it's doing philosophically is looking at what we think is a world in reality, which is really a discriminated construction of events and interpretations. And what Abhidharma does, it deconstructs that, it takes that apart and says, here's where this comes from, here's what this is, form is this, feelings are that, consciousness and so on and so forth. You can also look at the Dharma, 100 Dharma Shastra as another version of that. It maps out the mind and its states. It actually then maps it out in a very diagnostic, analytical frame for you. The value of this, not only is it precise in saying the buzz and swirl of what we call our world and reality can be looked at very clinically as made up of this and this and this and this. It's really detailed in how it does this. At the same time, it can become a diagnostic manual. So if you understand, say, the 100 Dharma Shastra, or you understand Abhidharma, when you get stuck in practice, klesha arises, afflictions, the knots. You can use this Abhidharma or the 100 Dharma Shastra to troubleshoot, like the troubleshooting section of a manual you get, and say, oh, here I'm in doubt, I'm really paralyzed by doubt. Or here I'm overcome with lust. Oh, here I'm argumentative. Oh, here this feeling arose. And then you go to the 100 Dharma Shastra, Abhidharma, and go, there it is. When this happens, this is your malfunctioning of this element of your being, and you can then use it as a corrective. So it's not just something, basically it's a systematic account of sentient experience. And it states everything in very psychophilosophical exact language. This is very useful if you apply it. If you just study and memorize it, it's interesting, but it's not meant to be done in that way. It's meant to be studied, understood, and then diagnostically applied. So it becomes, in a sense, a Shanjirsha, a good and wise advisor. And the thing that I found useful about it was used when various states or turnings, when you're moved, come up, and you get off center and you lose course. This diagnostic manual actually helps you pinpoint where that happened. And in a sense, it's universal across the human experience. It's not culturally bound, or even necessarily ethnically bound, or even ism bound. It's really presented as a complete, what they have the diagnostic manual that psychologists use to analyze various categories of mental illness and so forth. And as you go to medical school, you also learn the whole diagnostic scaffolding of how you would look at symptoms, diagnose, come up with prognosis and cure and so forth. These Abhidharma and say the 100 Dharma Shastra are meant to be used in the same way. They're meant to be used as diagnostic tools. Really, really good teachers know this and use it really well. And that's why they can impartially deal with states that come up with people, because they're looking at it clinically. Oh, that's happening. Let's run a few tests. My teacher run a few tests. So let's put, ooh, you're getting more angry. So where are we? You know, we know where this is now. And then you can untie it and treat it. So it's very important. So this is a positive use of discriminant or funbia or discernment. But along the negative use is that this process of discursive consciousness, and it's, by the way, it's called vijnana. Very interesting in Sanskrit, vijnana, which means divided knowing, divided consciousness, the vijnana. And what I'm going to present tonight on the Sanskrit, vikalpa, which is also the Sanskrit version of funbia, is the V in it again. So it's again the division, the dividing up, the splitting. You could say it's fractured awareness, fractured consciousness. Like you take a mirror, and the mirror really, if it's polished and well, really reflects things clearly. If you smash that mirror, like if you remember the safety glass windshield, when it smashes but doesn't fall apart, you get all these fragments, lattice fragments. And if you look through that, what you see is all this broken reality out there. Parts of this and parts of that. So you can use that metaphor to think about vijnana as the broken glass vision, and you can use jhana, which is without the vij, as a unified, seeing things clearly as they really are without these attached discriminations entering into it. Another word that can be used in this process is that reify. And basically, it's to reify comes from the Latin, it's to make something into a thing. Re or res is thing. And so phi is to make into a thing. So you're taking something that isn't a concrete necessarily, it's an imagined thing, and then you're reifying it and making it real. And so when you have the verse that all conditioned dharmas are unreal, they're dreams and so on and so forth, they're figments of imagination, you're using the reversal to not reify. So to reify is to actually take a concept and turn it into an objective reality. So basically what it's saying is we make distinct and separate what is essentially of a piece, and we color and paint and classify and categorize and split and elaborate it, and then make the mistake of thinking that what we've done conceptually and emotionally is actually real. And in the end, it's a big letdown, because it's not. It doesn't hold up. So the school in Buddha Dharma that's really aims at deconstructing the reification process is sometimes called Yogacara. So that's why this concept of funbia now starts going into deeply into Yogacara philosophy and Yogacara psychology. Obviously, I'm not going to finish this tonight, but I'll say two things about this. One, I'm going to maybe read a section here, what I think is one of the best concise statements of Yogacara accessible in English, which is basically looking at the functioning and the activities of consciousness as it creates, manufactures what we think to be a reality, but which is in fact our projections, expectations, fears, desires, reified or objectified into something that we consider real. But I'll read you that section maybe now. This comes from a really wonderful article by James Cleary, J.C. Cleary, where he's going into, and he's using the Avatamsaka Sutra, and he's saying the Avatamsaka Sutra contains principles and ideas and analysis that are really important for the modern world to get around of, that go beyond the normal ways in which we think and perceive, and will really be valuable to shift the paradigm that we're locked in right now with mostly our philosophical, psychological models. And then he goes into the Avatamsaka, but here, and he has certain axioms that he believes the Avatamsaka brings forth that help us shift that. And this, I'm going to quote now from him. This is his axiom 2 theory, or proposition 2. And it's titled, People Are Deluded by Conditioned Perceptions. And here's how he stated. I'll quote him directly. This axiom states that ordinarily, in their raw state, people are enclosed within a shell of conditioned perceptions, cut off from reality as such, and in touch only with the interpretations they've been trained to project upon the world. I mean, this is really both good scholarship and good writing. Again, in their raw state, in the unenlightened state, in the reflexive, conditioned existence that we are, people are enclosed within a shell of conditioned perceptions, not actual things, but conditioned, trained, modulated, switched and manipulated, cut off from reality. So the conditioned perceptions are not reality. They cut us off from reality and in touch only with the interpretations they've been trained, or they train themselves to project upon the world. In short, he says, they are trapped in conventional delusions. Then he goes on. This idea has been given various formulations. It is said that people are poisoned by desire, anger, and ignorance, that people are imprisoned in routine habits, that people are in the grip of karmic consciousness, and that the world that people perceive is like a dream or a magical illusion. The Yogacara teaching of the Buddha Dharma gives an analysis of the process of delusion quite consonant with modern ideas on cognition. According to Yogacara teaching, ordinary unenlightened people are not in touch with the world as it is. Instead, what they perceive is a system of mental representations that they have been conditioned to project upon the bare reality of the world. Their minds accumulate, and this is part of the, quote, learning process, they accumulate a stock of these mental representations in the course of their upbringing and acculturation, and they pass through life using this stock of concept and images to construct an imaginary reality. Imaginary, but consensually validated by the community that shares the same set of representations. Whoa. Now, remember, I quoted earlier that this learning by addition is what he's describing here. They accumulate a stock. We add to our stock. Remember the passage I gave you from the Tao Te Ching? It says, ordinary learning consists of adding to one's stock day by day by day. Learning in the Tao consists of subtracting from that, subtracting day by day. So this is what he's describing. Yogacara then is the learning by subtraction. Let me finish his quote. Ordinarily, the shell of conditioned perceptions is invisible to people as such because they reify their own constructs and think of them as independently existing phenomena. We forget that we are in an interactive movie of our own making, and we then think it's real. You know how you can get in a theater or get caught up in a movie or a dream, and man, it's like so real. If somebody taps you or says something, you snap out of it. But really good cinema or cinematography these days can cause you to be so absorbed in it that you cannot tell it's not real. In that moment, you actually think it's real. Only when the lights come on, it stops. You go, oh, yeah, wow, shoo. But what he's saying is, in a sense, the unawakened, conditioned mind is, in fact, in this movie 24/7. We are the directors. We're the actors. We set up all the screen. We even do the, what do you call the CGI, computer-generated, mental-generated imagery and whatnot. This is what the Buddha means by we are in a dream, drunk within a dream, and why awakened is used as the catalytic language to describe the attaining of, it's not the attaining, it's awakening from what he's describing here. The bundle of conditioned habits and perceptions which people then identify as themselves is, in the Buddhist view, the crux of delusion, the false self. This is the false self. What is the real self? It is the Buddha nature of sentient beings, their innate capacity for enlightened perception, for wisdom and compassion. Enlightened means activating this latent capacity, gaining the practical use of it in day-to-day life. In Chan terms, dying the great death refers to the death of the false self, which opens a way for the rebirth into the lucidity of direct perception. How is this person who has died the great death returned to life, asks the Chan going on. He cannot travel by light, he must arrive in broad daylight. Here, night symbolized the blanked out mental state. Broad daylight represents the active life in the world of differentiations working for universal liberation and so forth. So this is the passage from Clear, which I think is very clear and very helpful in describing it, not just according to the Avatamsaka text, but in modern understanding of what's going on here. It's not saying there is no reality outside of this mental. It's saying it's an interaction dynamic between the sense organs and the sense objects, and the consciousness is this director that's changing and manipulating it in such a way as to be this now, this later, that there, and so on and so forth. And the mistake is that when we get involved in this, it becomes so habitual and so powerfully repetitive that we don't stop to think that it's an actual activity of the mind at fabrication and not the real thing. Hence, the unawakened as opposed to awakened. So I will probably stop here tonight on this and go into this again on next Friday, because I think it's really important to analyze what this discrimination is talking about here and get this. I will say something though, as I thought about this, and maybe I'll say this a little more next week, because it's been coming up well, in my family to some degree, with mostly again with the kids, but not just with the kids anymore, clearly with the adults, is this absorption in what I would call the video games, virtual reality, and a world that's basically constructed in a three-dimensional way. The latest version of this is something you all know called metaverse, which is, and I can see the ads for this increasingly. I see reviews and ads where you see people with these devices covering their head and their eyes, and you look at them, and what they are is they have now taken the constructed, fabricated, unawakened mind and elevated it to another level. So instead, I mean, it's sort of like, it's not like it's a radical departure from that, but rather it's an extension, elaboration on it. So, and it feels natural to people to do this because in the unawakened normal state, that's what we're doing all the time. But now with these devices, we can just augment it to even a more refined, deeply absorbing state and go into it and then think, well, I'm just playing a game. But what they're finding is that people are increasingly finding it both difficult intellectually and psychophysically to separate that as a game. It starts to become their reality. But the Buddha wouldn't be surprised. He said, well, that's what they're normally doing. He says, oh, now they have games that do that for them besides? So they're adding a head literally on top of a head. It's really, I could talk about this more, but it just occurred to me as I was watching this that this feels, people slip into this so easily because it's a continuation of the unawakened state, prapancha, or vipalka or fumbia that's being described here. So that's why it's just they slip into it so easily. Of course, the danger of this is you are taking the mind to a corner, to a very refined space where it's going to be really hard to get back access to the ordinary unenlightened mind, because you have an extraordinarily unenlightened mind now through artificial intelligence, virtual reality, whatnot. So to come from that back to the ordinary unawakened mind seems like hell. So it could go from that to awakening. So what you're doing is you're taking steps away from even accessing human consciousness in its unawakened state through what was being described here. You're actually numbing it and overdosing it with prapancha to the nth degree, that it's almost going to be impossible for people once habituated to this, not only to not see through it, to see through it as a game, that they will actually think that this is reality, but to come back to the unreality real as a stepping stone to the real. So this is, it's just something I was thinking about today. It's both natural to people to do this because we do it all the time in the unawakened state, but it's also extremely dangerous because the fundamental treasury of the thus come one, which is human consciousness, is going to get so lost and covered over in this that it's almost going to be impossible to recover it and find it again. So to me, the importance of a monastery or a way place, especially one that's out in nature, it's one of those oases that allow for the recovery of this, the possible recovery of this. Anyway, I'll stop. I know I went over a little, and I'll continue on this next week because I think it's a really important series of concepts to get.
Marty, there's a question online.
Okay.
So how often does one meditate? How long do you meditate? Can you regress with age?
Can you what?
Can you regress with age in terms of your meditation ability? And when you bow, do you do full prostration or small bow?
So let's take those in order. That's one person asking, or are these a bunch of questions?
Just one person.
One person asking, so how long do you meditate? You asking me how long I meditate, or how long does one meditate? The first question I would answer, don't ask me how long I meditate, would be however long is necessary. That's not an evasive answer. Meditation is a tool for the recovery and understanding of consciousness. However long it takes you to use that tool to get recovery of that is how long you use it. It's an expedient device. If your meditation practice is advancing, it starts to, what's the word I want to use? Normalize, so that it's happening walking, standing, sitting, even in your sleep. But the sitting meditation practice alone is just a beginning to find and reestablish contact with the consciousness and watch what it's doing. Once you see, well, that's happening, and you see there's an alternative to just slipping and sliding with habituation, you start to be able to get a hold on your life. And then meditation, on one hand, isn't as necessary sitting all the time, because in a sense I'm trying to find the right word for it, but normalize is the right word. You've embodied it. And so the consciousness is now active all the time. That's called the dasanme, the great samadhi where there's no entry or leaving. Or the ishing samadhi, the single practice samadhi, walking, standing, sitting, lying down. So I would say at the beginning, probably longer is better. But once you start getting a feel for the world that you're entering through that, you use it as a tool then to correct your steps. What was the second question?
Like as you get older, in terms of your meditation.
As you get older?
Yeah, like did you regress backwards? Or does age have an effect in your meditation?
Yes and no. The best time to learn meditation and do it is when you're young, because once you have a supple and healthy body and get the position and you get the centering mechanism going, you feel it. As you get older, you can recover that even if your body's not strong anymore. But if you wait till you're 60 or 70 to start, it's a really uphill journey. Now, that's not the same as regressing. As I get older, I get more aware of how stupid and empty things are. So the regression doesn't necessarily happen with age. Actually, age should heighten the perception of the necessity for meditation and the emptiness of phenomena. There's no reason to suspect that meditation would deteriorate with age. In fact, everything I study and look at says it's the opposite. It's like any skill or art, the more you practice it over time, and since it's not dependent on youthfulness, and in fact somehow aging can help focus it more, it can and should get better and more refined. And you'll find in the biographies and autobiographies, often it's in advanced age that many of the great teachers and cultivators have their deepening awakenings, because it's an art, and an art takes time to perfect. What was bowing?
Yeah, like you do small bowing or big bowing?
A bowing is the same way. These teachings I expressed tonight are mind ground teachings, and it's the mind you're cultivating. The bowing and the sitting are expedients to help focus and center and elevate and activate the mind's awareness. So how you bow is much more important. I mean, the mind with which you bow is much more important, whether it's a little bow, a big bow, a long bow, a short bow. That's the quantifying thing, is not the measure, the qualitative state. You can sit quietly in an airplane or a car and be sitting there just with your eyes semi-closed and be bowing with one heart unconfused, sincerely and deeply, in a profound transformative way, and nobody sees it because your mind is completely caught up in that act of both worship, repentance, renewal, acknowledgement, gratitude, and whatnot that bowing involves. And that bow can be more powerful and have more merit and virtue than 1,000 done sort of like a parrot or a chicken, bowing. It's not that way. So I would say again, on the mind ground teaching, it's the mind with which you do it and not the act itself that determines the efficaciousness and the virtue of it. That's it on the questions?
Yep.
Okay. I don't know if they answered them, but at least I hope it steers towards the right direction. Okay. Sorry for the time loss.
Oh, no problem.
Except I got an email from one of my students that, I'm reading the Avatamsaka and listening to your talks, like I'm wondering, is time real even? Is there such a thing as time? So that's for another night. Yeah, anyhow.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So, so Marty was talking a bit tonight about discrimination or funbia, and Jing Wei Shi kind of nudged me and said, "Oh, you can talk about the mountain path." I don't know if people know, but DRB is going to be hosting an online screening of a movie recently made by Ted Berger, talking about the hermits in China. And the reason that I think it came up connecting it with discrimination is because if you want to see people who are really cultivating a mind of stillness, peace, and getting caught up in the world, you really can see that being embodied, interesting, on cinematography in films. And I was just kind of reflecting a little bit about it, and I remember watching it for the first time when I saw it the first time. Ted Berger made another movie that people might know called Amongst White Clouds, which is what this new movie is actually kind of re-envisioning. I remember I watched that movie for the first time at Buddha Root Farm in nature on Turtle Mountain. I think Locke showed it, right? Yeah, Locke showed it. We were all up at the very top of the Chan Hall, and he had this little projector screen, a little projector, and we watched this film. And it definitely had a feeling like, wow, what's on that screen was what we're doing here on Turtle Mountain, in nature, studying the Dharma, meditating, practicing together. But these people have actually taken it as an entire lifestyle full time. And I thought of maybe just sharing a few of things from that movie. And also I found a list of intentions that Ted has in making his films that I thought was actually quite interesting. He's actually trying to lead people to discernment rather than to discrimination. So one of the hermits shared this with Ted Berger when he's making the film. He says, grasping hold of emptiness, you want to talk about the real. Show me one thing that's real. There's nothing real from the start. Every day, morning to night, gathering things big and small, valuables, money, name and recognition, gathering it all up into your lap, like you're holding a golden key. Busy your whole life for nothing, acting like a thief. Why not put all this energy into liberation? Put this mind to the path. Everyone in the world is controlled by desire. Shed this control and you'll be free, content and liberated. So that's when the hermits was sharing with Ted. I think he was asking the question, if I remember correctly, what is real? Asking this, what's real? What's real? It says, everything that people are chasing in the world, is that real? Mm-hmm. And then I was looking a little bit more about this movie, and I was really moved by Ted Berger. He actually has 5 intentions as he's making movies. And so one of them is organic filmmaking. He says, let the story tell itself. So that's actually interesting, right? Rather than a kind of a prefabricated story you want to tell, you actually let something naturally unfold. And I think we find that in Ted Berger's films. The second one he calls shared journeys. He says, if we look deeply and share openly, the stuff of life is shared across borders and across species. So again, the kind of removing of discriminations, the removal of kind of one way of doing things, but actually just being deeply open allows us to cross the boundaries of culture, cross the boundaries even of just being human. And I think what's quite striking in that movie is actually Ted's humility. And he goes to these monks, and I think why the monks are so authentic with him is there's a kind of sincere wish to learn that it's palpable in this young man when he's showing in this movie, wanting to learn from these hermit monks, wanting to ask them about their life, and then wanting to sincerely share that with the rest of the world. You don't get the sense that he's doing this for fame. He's doing this because he deeply cares on what really means to be human. So number 3, he has process of inquiry. He said sharing questions is more important than having answers. I thought that's really DRBU. So it's very good that DRBU is showing this movie because definitely there's a spirit of shared inquiry there, of asking good questions and letting the answers just kind of organically come to the surface. So I think when we watch the movie, you don't come away with like, I know what this movie is about. I've got it. It's like, what am I doing with my life? Number 4, which goes directly to what Marty was just saying, is attention and mindfulness. He says, choose to make films that cultivate mindfulness, not distraction. That would be very useful for all the people who are using technology, making technological devices. As, can I make these devices, these books, these movies, this music in a way that leads to people's deeper well-being rather than just kind of exciting the senses to maybe make a profit. Number 5, he says, wonder and inspiration. And I like his little tagline. He says, this is all we really need. And I think that's actually what comes from actually letting go of discrimination. It's not that we somehow, by letting go of our narrative, we're in some kind of abyss. I mean, for sure, maybe in the beginning there's a sense of losing something because we've been clinging so tightly to our story for so long. But as we start to let go and start to open up, we realize, wow, there's just so much all around us that we can just be amazed by. Be curious about, learn from, really enjoy. And it's very simple. It's not, doesn't need a, kind of artificial intelligence VR machine to take us into some fantasy world where we can then have everything we want met. You can actually just be content here and now, enjoying the moment with almost nothing but the breath that we can breathe, the sense of a kind of safe place to meditate and be in community. So I thought actually that those 5 things kind of really kind of maybe give a more concrete way that all of us can actually cultivate this practice of not getting lost in discrimination, not going to funbia, but say if we can let life live itself, right? Share the journeys with all those around us, have a real inquiry, not going for quick answers, do activities that lead to more attention and mindfulness, and finally kind of live in wonder and inspiration. So anyways, so what DRBU is going to have this event is on November 1st. So if you would like to join, November 1st, 6:30 p.m., DRBU will be hosting an online screening.
That's what, Tuesday?
Tuesday evening, yeah, Tuesday. Jingwei Sure and myself were asked us to help facilitate, just towards us introducing that we're going to watch this movie. But we also are very fortunate because actually Ted Berger and Reverend Heng Sure will actually have a conversation after the movie. So definitely welcome everyone to join. I think you have to actually register. So go to the berkeleymonastery.org website. You'll find a link. You can click it. You can register. And I think you'll get the information from there. So yeah, encourage everyone to join in. Tuesday, 6:30 p.m. Okay, so maybe we do dedication of merit. We do have an Amitabha session, November 4th to 6th. So that's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We have transmitting 8 precepts on Friday morning. And we also have a chance to put up memorial plaques for those you care about. For those who've passed away, there's the rebirth plaque. And for those who are still with us in this world, we have the long life plaques. So you can put up a total of 2 plaques. Okay. Otherwise, I think we just have our regular monastery schedule. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.